Hello, everyone. I will be going through a project today where I try to scrape players that played in the 2021 season in the NBA. So, the page that I will be using is Hispanos NBA, which I just stumbled upon and thought it was a helpful resource for um, getting this information into a table. So, the title of my project is Every Stat, Every Player, Every Game. And the goal is to scrape every player and merge that information with player statistics from the 2021 season. So, first thing we're going to look at is the structure of this Hispanos NBA website. We see that they've got an alphabetical index, and once you click each letter, it gives you a list of players and a couple of other attributes. And what we'll do is cycle through this website and try to grab every player from each letter of the alphabet. So we can see that the way that this website is structured, there's an A at the end here. If I was to type in a B, it would bring us to all the players whose last names start with B, and so forth. So another important detail for the sake of our code is there's no players in the NBA whose last name starts with a U or an X. And we'll just need to adjust our code accordingly. So I've created an NBA alphabet, which doesn't include the last names that start with U or X. And the first thing here is just looping through as a test to make sure that we're printing out each letter from this NBA alphabet and it looks good. So next up, we will create an empty data frame. This will tell the program that when we eventually are appending these player names and the other attributes on the table, it'll append it to the first thing it'll do is append those values to the empty data frame, and then it'll go through the for loop, get the next list of players, and continue to append to it. So first thing that we're doing is creating this for loop that says for the letter in that list of NBA alphabet, go through and plug that letter into this URL. Just what I showed manually, but this program will go and do this on its own. After it plugs in a letter in that URL, it'll then grab that player table and append it to the empty data frame and continue to do that for the entirety of that NBA alphabet. So players started out as our empty data frame, and at the end of this loop, it creates the entire data frame. So I will restart this program just to show it actually runs pretty quickly. So up top, just imported the necessary packages to complete this web scrape, and some of these other packages are helpful for future data analysis projects. I typically just import these packages regardless of what I'm working on. Sometimes I import some other ones too, but for this project I won't be using all of them. So right now we are just going through, and like I said, it actually runs surprisingly quickly considering it's grabbing a lot of players from the NBA. When there's this asterisk here, it's showing that it's working. Also up in this top right corner, when that's black, it's showing that it's still perfect. Kernel's busy. Okay, so it's completed the web scrape, and by typing in players.head, that just shows the first 5 values or first 5 rows of the data frame. Okay, so just cleaning up a little bit. So what we have, the first thing that we're looking at is we want to remove values where there's, or remove rows where there's the dashes. So this player right here did not play in the 2021 season. On the actual Hispanos NBA webpage, it says in the NBA from to. So you can see we don't want to have for the sake of this project, we don't want to have players that didn't play in that 2021 season. So we remove those dash values. So we're pretty much saying clean table is equal to that other table, not including the dash values. So now we have that, and run this. I've saved it to a CSV file so we can take a look at the file in a little more depth. So this is clean table. So we see no missing rows, no rows with the dashes in the to column, and okay, yeah, so back to the code. So what we're doing here is we're just creating a list from that data frame, and it's pretty much saying active players is equal to the list. So sorry, active players is going to be a list of the column name. So when we print active players, here is the list of all players from the 2021 season. Okay, so that's the first part of scraping information. The next big part of this project is going to be pulling information from the Basketball Reference website. So I'm going to switch over to Basketball Reference. And this is a great source of information for player statistics. The first player we can look at is we can look at LeBron James. And what we'll want is to scrape the information from this 2021 season and put it into a data frame. Eventually we'll have a massive data frame that has every player that played in the 2021 season and their game-by-game statistics. Okay, so the first step that we're going to need to take for this is to create a key that will fit in the Basketball Reference URL. So the way that the URL is structured is it's pretty much an index of the first letter of the last name. Then there's a slash, and it's the first 5 letters of the last name, then the first 2 letters of the first name, and then 01 if that's the first time that that key has been used. And so we're going to need to convert this list of player names into that key. And the reference code down here that I created, I practiced with the name Giannis Antetokounmpo. So it's a little difficult to follow, but I'm essentially saying grab the first 5 letters of the last name, grab the first letter of the last name / first 5 letters of the last name, and then first 2 letters of the first name, and then put on a 01 at the end. And so up here I've got active players, and I'm saying, okay, create an empty list called player codes from the list of active players. Go through a for loop where you pull for each player in the active players list. First, you're going to make it a string, and then we're putting in the 01 to put in at the end of the value. We need to get rid of the space between the first and the last name. We need to check the length of the last name or the full name. And this is pretty much just how we're blending all of that information together to get that output that we can paste into the URL. And so this is what this function creates. If you have any questions about this in particular, please send me a message. I can go into it in some greater detail, but this is, I'd rather just focus on some of the other stuff for right now. Okay, so what we have is the opportunity to plug in all of these player keys in the Basketball Reference webpage. And unfortunately, there's a little bit more cleaning of this list before we do that. The first thing that I saw was, for example, this name right here. I believe the player's name is DJ Augustine. We need to understand how the URL handles situations where there's D period J period as a name. So let's just see how that works. So player's name is DJ Augustine, and let's see how the URL handles that. Okay, so it doesn't have any periods in the name, so we're gonna need to remove that, and a couple other names that we'll see. Okay, so the other thing that I previously mentioned was if that key is the first time that that key has been created, that will get a 01 at the end. But there are some cases where that name key has already been used on the Basketball Reference page. So for example, the player Harrison Barnes, he is the second one who has had this key. The first one happens to be a player by the name of Harry Barnes who played in 1969, and we can look up Harry Barnes. So Harry Barnes, this is his page, and when we look up here, he gets the 01. So when I put in a 02 here, it should take us to Harrison Barnes' page. And same thing for his 2021 statistics. So that's why we'll need to go through and make some manual adjustments. I didn't know that Harry Barnes was another player that played in 1969, but my code down here helped me identify where there were holdups. So essentially what happened was I went through a for loop that used these codes, and whenever it didn't work, so for example, I'll use that DJ Augustine example right here. The code would go try to plug this information in, and it wouldn't be able to grab anything. So at this point I was alerted that the code didn't work, and then I would have to go and manually adjust it. I'm sure that there are some practices that could be included to make that run smoothly, where I could have checked for periods in the list and then been identified holdups there, or I could put something in that says if it doesn't work with 01 at the end of the code, go to 02 and see if that works, and so on. But the approach that I took, just based on my experience, was to manually go in and change some of these values. So you see some 02s down here. And so now to the fun part. I start with an empty data frame again, and I say for each code in the adjusted codes list, we're going to plug that code into the URL, just like I've done manually a couple times. And what it's doing is it's pulling the table of statistics from that web page, and how it identifies that table is in this code right here. I needed to identify where on the page it was grabbing that table from. So if I put in a 1 here, I think it would take, let's go to LaMarcus Aldridge. If I was to put in a 1 on this page, I think it would just pull this information. And if I put in a 2, it might pull this, 3, 4, something like that. But it was kind of a trial and error situation. But when I had 7 identified here, it's pretty much saying the 7th element of the URL of the web page, grab that information. And go through that entire adjusted codes list and continue to append to the data frame. Once a player is added, start with the next one, append that information, and continue doing that. So now I have a data frame of all of those players' game-by-game statistics. And just by looking at the first 20 rows of the table, it's looking pretty good because the first player code that we used for this web scrape, it's looking like all of that information was pulled. So I will export this to a CSV just to look at it in a little more depth. And so every player, or every stat, every player, every game. And here it is. Okay, so this is a massive data frame. It should have every, should have every stat of every player of every game. Okay, and the first thing that sticks out is these rows that we don't want. The inactives, did not play, did not dress. We're going to want to get rid of those for sure. The other observation that I have is we're going to want to remove these rows right here. Really, all we care about is making sure that these are there, but we don't want the separation between player names. So right here, it switches over to, so it looks like there's just periodic postings of this row, so we'll get rid of that. So cleaning the data frame, first thing I did was convert some of the values in the columns to floats. This is just, I knew that I would, for some of my future data analysis, I would need these values in numeric form. A lot of times when you import information from websites, it will be structured in a string format, which makes it difficult because if you go to make a calculation on that value, you cannot do calculations on string values. They need to be in numeric form. So I can't remember what form these were in before, but just a good practice to convert them to numeric. So and even if they already are in numeric, it's just a good practice. So first step of cleaning was to anywhere where the data frame has a blank in the game column, we're going to remove that. So we're saying anytime that column value contains this, we don't want that. So and then the next thing is anytime the column RK contains that value, we want it to we want to remove that. So and I'll show that in a second. So every stat cleaned data frame, I export it, and let's check it out. Okay, so this looks pretty clean. We have our player codes on the right side, and there's no missing rows. So in the previous table, we could see where in the G column, anywhere there was a 0, or I'm sorry, anywhere there was an empty value, we got rid of those rows, and anywhere where there was RK in the RK column, we removed those rows, and that's what produced this semi-final product. And now we have a nice clean data frame that we can go into some further data analysis with. Just looking at what some of our next steps could be, you could create a dictionary of the player codes and the player names, and then add a column in that has the player's name if you mind working with the player code. So I think in some of my projects that was the next step that I took, but for now that should that'll be where I stop. So this is the first time I've posted a video on YouTube. My goal is to continue to share some of the projects that I work on, and I'm hoping to get feedback, whether that's advice or potential errors that you see in my code. And I'm hoping to network with other data scientists and continue to improve my skills. If you want to share some code with me, I'd be happy to take a look at it. And if you have any project ideas, please reach out to me and I will certainly get back to you. So thank you for watching this video, and let me know if you have any questions.